And we will be sharing out key pieces of information and takeaways from this meeting at the end. So you'll have kind of the overview of what we talked about. So the intent of today's meeting is really to continue the discussion around design and designing the tests that we are going to start testing in Q4 related to a geographic landscape map of the services that you all provide in Contra Costa County. So we'll kind of spend some time doing an overview of what we've been doing over the last month. A lot of you have participated in some of the discovery and design sessions. Thank you, thank you, thank you. And then we'll spend some time really digging into what's next and where we plan on going from here. Next slide. This is our stock slide. I hope those of you who are joining are familiar now with CalAIM. If you are unfamiliar with CalAIM, maybe this is the first time you're joining a CPI, please reach out to us. We would love to chat with you more, set up a one-on-one meeting, talk a little bit more about CalAIM and then the Path Collaborative Planning and Implementation Initiative, or the CPI initiative. This here talks a little bit more about what CalAIM is. It's essentially the transformation of Medi-Cal with 3 primary goals. I won't spend time reading the slide, but it's here for you to look at if you're unfamiliar with CalAIM at large. Next slide. These are our collaborative agreements. These have been our agreements since Q1 of this year. We're really, we share these at every meeting, and we ask you to spend just a little bit of time looking at them, thinking about them, and thinking about what agreements you want to call into this space today. So I'll pause talking for just a second, if you wouldn't mind reading them, and then feel free, if you would like, to come off mute or to put in chat anything that really stands out, any of the agreements that you want to call into the meeting today. And as we continue throughout the day or the morning, I would just ask to continue to reflect on these and bring some of these into the discussion that we have. We do hope that this is an interactive conversation, so thinking about these as we go would be good. Next slide. Okay, so this is just a quick slide to reshare that we've made some changes to the meeting invitations. So we've heard from a few of you recently that there's been some confusion about what meetings we're having, what meetings we're not, and what links to use. We did change from having a standing meeting using Google Calendar as an invite to using Zoom registration, and we canceled that standing meeting from your calendars and instead have been asking you to register via Zoom. We did that because we were hearing that there's been a lot of kind of Google emails going back and forth from our calendars. Every time we add somebody to the meeting invite, you get inundated with new invites in your inbox, and it's just been a lot. It also helps us better manage who's coming to the meetings. So there has been a change where we've canceled that meeting invite, and we're now asking you to register for each of the meetings independently. What you will see is probably a cancellation email, but then you would need to go in and delete that standing meeting from your calendar if it's still there. Google and some other calendars like Outlook don't sync well together. So when we cancel a meeting on our end, it doesn't always show up on your end. The meeting dates and times are still the same. So nothing changes in the sense of the time of the meeting, the day of the meeting, the length of the meeting. The real change is how you get to the meeting and how you see that on your calendar, which would be getting there through the Zoom registration. Next slide. Okay, so I'm going to pass it over to Lauren to talk a little bit more about where we've come from and some of the steps that we've been taking over the last 2 months or so related to design.
Thanks, Danny. And I'll just acknowledge you all that this conversation is going to be a lot of us talking and reporting back out because there have been so many conversations since August in big spaces and small spaces. So acknowledging that that's not our usual best use of our time today, but we've got a lot to round down on because we've got a test we're launching as of today. So hang in. Folks might remember in August, we asked CPI participants in our first Contra Costa in-person meeting to help us think about what problem we're trying to solve as it relates to our ability to implement CalAIM in Contra Costa County and use it as a way to transform the way we provide more equitable healthcare to the CalAIM populations of focus. At the end of that conversation, oh, you can go back, Shelby, sorry. Um, at the end of that conversation, we identified 8 guideposts that we thought would help achieve person-directed care, and we voted and selected one guidepost that was focused on transparent data sharing and equitable access across all provider types as the element we wanted to really focus on. Next slide, Shelby. In September, that's a really big topic. So in September, in the monthly meetings, CPI participants worked to identify 12 potential solutions using a human-centered design tool called How Might We to help us think about how might we achieve that desired guidepost. We then voted on those 12 identified solutions, and 2 were voted the highest for solutions design, and we're prioritizing one of the 2. We're prioritizing something that's more of a prerequisite, as you all have identified, thinking about how do we map out the landscape of our current services and help us see one another and the services we provide better across the county. The other one we will absolutely pursue, but we are pausing because doing right by this question of leveraging existing technologies to better support the service that are provided to the people we intend to impact through CalAIM really requires that we actually bring those people into the discussion. And that is something we take really seriously and want to be really thoughtful about. So we are in parallel of developing internally to the facilitation team a community engagement strategy so we can do right by a design process and really bringing in those folks to help design against that second question. So we're really focused on the first one right now. You can go to the next slide. In October and November, just under 30 participants participated in some ad hoc design sessions. Again, if you were there, thank you so much. We know we asked for more and additional time. We thought it was really worth it. We hope you did too. Thinking about that, how might we develop a geographic map to better see and understand the services is like, that's still a really big thing to bite off as a collective community of so many diverse providers across a pretty big geography. So we use those design sessions to take bites out of kind of the sub questions that would get us to designing an actual tool. We thought about what do we need to know about one another's services? How are we going to collect that information from you all as service providers in ways that's sustainable, reliable, high quality, doesn't drive y'all crazy? And then thinking about how will that aggregate view of all of that data be shared in a way that's accessible, engaging, and easy to understand. Our design sessions really for this moment focused on the first 2 questions. We started to dip our toes into the last question, and we'll continue to think more about that visual. You can go to the next slide. So it leads us to today. Today, we are launching our test, our first test. Testing is going to occur in 2 cohorts. Cohort 1 that will launch today is for those of you who provide services across the county that need to provide information as input to the visual that will then be used. Cohort 2 will be the folks that are actually going to use that tool to navigate services for and with the community members you all are serving through CalAIM. We recognize there might be overlap. People might be, given the services you all provide, you might be in cohort 1 and cohort 2. That is fine. We have to start with element 1, though, of actually getting reliable information to repopulate this map that can then be used. So more to come, but the test will occur in 2 cohorts, and we're launching the first one today. You can go to the next slide. For those that participated in the design session, this is your work that we've just organized. We again started by asking what information do you need to know about one another's services? And if you were in those conversations, you know in person, that was a really overwhelming flip chart with post-its that were falling off and maybe stressing Shelby out that she was going to leave one on the floor. For those that were in the virtual session, it was a bunch of post-its on a Miro board. We as the facilitation team visualized all of that information through Miro, and then we actually organized it to create these buckets. which are labeled with the black Post-its. So there's some basic stuff, right? Like basic information about your organization, information about the geographic span. Capacity was something that was named by so many people as a data element of interest for this information. We will also be, this is in your participant Miro board. So if you want to like zoom in on all of the details, we can make sure you guys get that link so that you can do that. The other thing we did as facilitators, so this notion of affinitization is like a sentence making exercise of like, show me all the patterns. And, you know, if there's a lot of people saying the same thing, well, that probably means there's energy behind that notion, right? So we did that affinitization. You'll also notice these tiny dots that are green, yellow, and red. Those dots were again, us as facilitators taking a first crack at what should be in the bounds of the initial information that we're collecting. And we used dots to indicate this information is important and should be in the visual. We used the colors to indicate do it now, think about it, maybe do it now, do it later, hold and make sure you do it in the next version. Notion of like, how easy or hard is this? You'll notice that there was a lot of energy around using this tool to get feedback from people. Is the service quality? Is it what's the community member or their navigator's experience of providing of the referral? That's super important. That's not going to be in the bounds of our initial test because there's a lot of design elements we have to think about to make that functionality come to life. I just use that as an example of one of the few red dots that are on this screen. Again, we'll make sure you have access to the raw information, but hopefully this feels validating to see all the information you guys have provided. And then again, us as facilitators doing some work to actually do the sense making to understand what's going to be in the bounds of this initial, what information will be asked and visualized in the initial test that we are about to launch. Let me just pause and see if folks have questions or comments on kind of the process we've been in. Again, fully acknowledging I'm doing a lot of talking at, which is my least favorite thing, but especially with this voice. Let me pause. Any questions, comments, reactions to where we've been? And I am just going to throw into the chat that Miro board in case folks want to like zoom in while you're in the meeting on that, the detail that's on this slide. Cool. So if there's no questions or comments, I'll hand it back to Danny to help us think about what's next and what the bounds of our test look like.
Yeah, thanks, Lauren. So for the rest of Q4, we are going to try to test this, what came out of the design session. So this kind of prototype of this landscape map or geographic map. But there's a couple of things that we want to call in related to this. So first, that what you will see and what we're testing is going to be joyfully scrappy, to use Lauren's word. You've probably heard us talking or heard this term before if you've been in these design sessions, but we're here basically just to see if something works. It won't be pretty. It's not going to be the final product, but we're really wanting to just see if we can get a process in place that might work, and doing that in a way that is not, it's not going to be perfect and it's not going to be pretty. We also want to call out or call in that the data is yours and it's not the database administrators. So we're still, in process, and we'll talk about that in a little bit to figure out what's the end for this and who owns this over time. But ultimately, this is your data and will continue to be your data related to the services that you provide, your capacity, et cetera. And then our role as a facilitator for CPI, we are helping to facilitate the test. So we did a lot of work, as Lauren just shared, related to design, helping to come up with what the test might be based off of your input and kind of your thinking. But you all are really going to be the ones that are helping to administer that and then own what's final. We are here for a period of time in the county, but this is something hopefully that long-term will be a solution for you all as service providers or as organizations helping service providers. So ultimately, this will be your solution over time that you will continue to own. And then in terms of responsibility breakdown, so just digging into that last point a little bit more, this is just kind of a delineation of who's doing what for this first test. I talked to a lot of this already, but just to be clear and kind of call out what's on the screen here. So Intrepid is the facilitator. We're helping to design the test, which is what we've been doing. And then we'll help to facilitate the test. So we'll talk a little bit more about what the what is there. But we've kind of created the backend structure to collect the data and really help to get some of this information that will eventually go on to this geographic map, whatever it ends up looking like. We will work with you all to identify potential solutions for this long term. So one of the things that we heard in the design session is that there's a lot already out there. Let's not recreate the wheel. And so we want to do a little bit more exploring about that and see, is there a place where this will naturally land over time. So we can, Intrepid will kind of take on working with you all to identify those opportunities, but then take on actually having some meetings and thinking about that in a little bit more detail. And then we'll support designated owners in identifying CalAIM related funding. So we recognize whatever the what is likely will need to be funded in some way. But there is funding available right now. And so really working to think about what that could be and helping to support that long term to really identify a solution that's meaningful and works for Contra Costa. And then you as the participant, you will participate in the test. So you will provide your data or your input. You will help to share this information out and share out the survey that we'll be using for this out. And then you'll own the transition from the test to implementation. So, long term, as we're starting to march towards something that will be more like a final product, you all will have a role to play in that and help us identify what that final product should be, where it will live. And then, depending on the owner of that long term, we really would look to you all to help us pursue some of that funding that we help kind of collectively identify. Any questions about the responsibility breakdown before we move on to the next slide? Okay, feel free to put them in the chat too as they arise.
Before we go into the landscape discovery, Danny, can you provide just a few sentences on what you heard in the CPI facilitators conversation last week about this notion? Because I think that's important context.
Yeah, thanks, Lauren. So I met with other CPI facilitators across the state last week and with DHCS. And we were talking about different PDSAs that the CPIs were working on. So taking a step back even from this geographic map, for those of you that are in other CPIs, you probably are hearing the language related to test of change or PDSAs or opportunities for change or enhancing implementation of ECM and community supports. And that's because DHCS has really structured the CPI collaboratives to focus on specific tests of change. As we start looking at 2024, we can share more about what that will look like for next year. But just saying that you've probably heard this language in other CPIs, and you will continue to hear that language here and in other CPIs as well, because the state is really asking this to be a forum where people can identify what's not working and what is working and do iterations and tests to try to enhance what's working and to try to create some solutions to what's not. So in the meeting that we had last week, when we were talking about care coordination in particular, one of the primary tests of change that came up is this concept of a provider directory, because other collaboratives are also coming to the realization that in order to do care coordination, in order to do referrals, in order to really talk with others in your network, you need to first understand who is in your network. So there are other CPI collaboratives that are doing different types of a landscape assessment or different types of a provider directory, depending on the terminology that you're using. And we presented that to DHCS as something that's happening across the collaboratives and something that CPIs potentially could standardize over time, or at least lean into over time independently as CPIs. And DHCS very much liked that idea and validated that it was a really important thing that needs to happen. and that it needs to happen locally. So just all of that to say that, the state has heard that we're working on this and that others are, and they're really excited about that idea because they see the value and the need, and that it really should live within the CPIs and within kind of local communities or geographic regions. So just wanted to share that.
Awesome. And thanks, Danny. And I want to provide that as backdrop because I'm sure, like a lot of you, I have been in 1,000 conversations in the last decade plus about a list of resources and service providers that is reliable. And it is both infuriating and a little validating to hear that it is still a major issue, even for something as scoped as CalAIM. And I don't know, for me, it was a little bit motivating to hear that there was energy around it, even though it very much frustrates me, and I can't wait to not talk about a list of providers. But we haven't gotten there in the last decade plus, so maybe we'll get there in this community. To that point, and the point Danny made earlier, there's a lot that already exists. Partially, again, we wanted to start by asking what information is important because we didn't want to presume and just riff off of an existing tool if it didn't actually fit the need. So we started by asking you all to help us understand what information you needed. We heard that, and in that process, we heard a few places where people were like, well, so-and-so does such and such, and maybe we can build off of that or adapt that. And so we wanted to provide a really brief overview of some of the landscape discovery we did as part of this design process as well, to show what already exists so that you can also start to see where we might either find inspiration as it relates to an element of our test and or find the potential future home in an enhanced way. So one of the first things we looked at was the San Diego 211 CIE team's CalAIM information. All of these slides have hyperlinks to these tools. So everybody, once you get these slides, will have access to all this information. These are just some screenshots to make it easy. So they have a CalAIM page. If you click on that, review San Diego's list of CalAIM providers, it links you to a publicly available SharePoint site that is screenshotted to the right. What we were inspired by this is this notion of this notion of joyfully scrappy, a publicly available directory format that is able to be navigated and hosted in something that that is kind of ubiquitously available to the public, like a SharePoint site, or I think in our instance, it'll probably be a Google Sheet. Next slide. The other thing we looked at was Contra Costa Health's Find Help page. When we were looking through, the thing that was really inspiring here, again, we heard a lot of desire around capacity. We know the capacity question is a real-time question that can be hard to get reliable answers to. What was nice about the Contra Costa Health Find Help page is it just had this toggle of things, the service is available or it's not available. That is not entirely fitting what information you all said you wanted in those design sessions, but again, was inspiring for an element that will be a precursor to any capacity fields we want to include in our directory. Next slide. There was some, particularly in the housing design session, there's a lot of calling in the Contra Costa 211 directory. So we did look at that. And that actually inspired our non-CalAIM service categories. They have this pretty well-defined service tree. Again, if you click on the link, you would go right to it. This is just a screenshot that both has those headers and some really well-defined definitions against each of these headers. One of the things that we heard loud and clear in the design sessions is we don't just want a directory of the CalAIM services, so the 14 community supports and ECM. When you're supporting people who have complex needs, sometimes they're just hungry, sometimes they have legal needs, and it has nothing to do with the community supports available to them or ECM, but has everything to do with their health and wellness. So our directory will include CalAIM services and non-CalAIM services, and it was really inspiring to see this service tree, and it's how well defined it was, and we're just going to adopt it for the bounds of the test, particularly to categorize non-CalAIM services. Let me just pause, and particularly Ryan Shelby as my co-conspirators in design work. Any other voiceover you guys would offer in what we saw as we did this landscape discovery?
No, I mean, I think you captured it really well.
One of the things I will offer, I see your question in the chat, Amy. One of the things I will offer too is in each of these, with the exception of the San Diego CIE roster, because that is explicitly about CalAIM, there wasn't any CalAIM language, right? Which felt like a pretty big gap as we think about what we're trying to deliver. To your question, Amy, around do any of them have interoperability functions? Not so far as we can tell. However, one of the next steps that we will take on as facilitators is doing a double click conversation with each of the admins of these sites to better understand what is the actual functionality. What is the actual functionality on the back end once you're a user? We were only able to look at the publicly available sites at this moment. And again, part of this is like you all told us what to look into. So if there's other things to look into, or if you have additional information that you want to offer here or outside of this conversation, we're totally open to that. Amy, does that answer in process, admittedly not content, the question you were asking, or do you want to say more to what you were offering there?
I mean, I always want to say more.
You're welcome to.
So I think the reason I'm asking that is because I worked pretty closely in Sonoma County on building something very similar to this. And one of the larger complaints, both on the health sector side, but also on the social service sector side, is it yet one more thing to log into? And so I think being mindful of that, yes, we need this to support clients and to be better collaborators. But also, if you're a boots on the ground person and you're in one system and then you have to log into another system that's a different password and a different password changing cadence, so it's not the same password that you had before, and then you have to remember to go back and loop it back in because there's no closed loop referral system, like that becomes, on paper, it's not that hard. But in reality, it is incredibly challenging for your boots on the ground folk. And so, what you're presenting, while scrappy, could potentially be pretty game changing for the community. And so really being mindful of, if we're presenting that or we're pushing that we've considered those aspects around interoperability. And I know some of the organizations don't want to be interoperable because they think it'll affect their market share. So, trying to use resources and pull on that, I think would be really helpful.
Yeah. I really appreciate that, Amy, and really, really well said. I love when things are identified as scrappy but potentially game changing. Like that's the matrix. That's the intersection we want to be at. So let's try to hit that out of the park there. Few thoughts, and I would love other people on the phone to share as well. First off, firsthand perspective, I've been there. I understand completely. Say no more. What a pain in the butt, right? Totally get it. Part of step one of this process is kind of backfilling the existing service map and the back end, because in the absence of a quality back end, nothing's worse than having to log into 3 systems and still not getting the thing that you want, right? So I just want to start by starting at the beginning, which in fairness to this group, you all asked us to start at, which is like, let's get a quality system in place. What I also appreciate that you offered, Amy, is the to what end use case of this tool is to actually help with enrollment and solve enrollment gaps for those that are eligible for community supports and ECMs and might have other basic needs that prevent people from accessing those things, to actually access those things, which is in fact the Contra Costa County CPI aim. So you have taken us 5 steps into the future, and rightfully so, because that is exactly why we are doing what we are doing here. And I think that part of what we need to do is continue to design with the end in mind. I think that's part of why having these conversations with you all as service providers to uplift these things that are important, which will help us know how to use the time and have conversations with those database admins. Like, what are the functionalities we need, not just for step 1, but for steps 1 through 5, which concludes in a closed loop referral system that is viable, right, for us to actually increase enrollment and provide better care. So just some of the riffs I have, but I'm curious if what Amy offered inspired other thoughts or perspectives from folks on the phone. And honestly, y'all, even just a yes plus one to Amy, what Amy said would also be really helpful.
Michael, not to call you out, but to call you in. I'm curious from your perspective as a service provider and supporting your staff, did what Amy share resonate with you? And also did what Lauren, like, so I think what Lauren is saying is yes, plus one, Amy, and in order to get there, we first need to build a quality database, quality background, which is kind of this scrappy crappy is what we're kind of focusing on here. But just curious, kind of from your perspective, if you have thoughts. I also know you're kind of in a unique position where you do have access to a little bit more data in a way that's interoperable, so you can see the benefit of that. But curious if you have any thoughts there.
Yeah, no, I think we need the information at our fingertips. And yes, I do have a little bit more information, but there's still a lot of information out there that I don't have access to. And I think as a service provider, and especially thinking about our frontline staff, who are really the ones doing the majority of the work, we need something that's easy for them to access, and then something that guides them appropriately into where they need to be. So I'm 100% on board with what we're talking about. And I don't think the 211 database at this point captures what we're looking for. It could potentially, as long as we have, the feedback of the group and it meets the needs of everyone who's doing this work. I think it potentially could, but it's a good starting point. And yeah, if I was to ask any of our frontline staff that are doing the work how they access the support services that are needed across Cal-AIM, none of them would be able to give us an answer. So I think we're on the right track. Now it's how do we take the information, put it somewhere where it's usable, and then bring it down to our frontline staff who are doing the work, right? Because I have the information, they don't yet. So
great. Well, thanks for sharing. And I would just encourage this conversation to continue. I mean, we are wanting to design something with you all. So continuing, as Lauren said, continuing to keep the end in mind as we're having these conversations of what do we want this to be in the future will help us design the here and now, and also will help us figure out our guardrails and our pathways to get to that end goal. So I just really appreciate the conversation, and thank you for sharing, Amy, and bringing that in. And would encourage all of you to continue to bring that in as we're continuing to talk.
Yeah. And Jamie just put in the chat a publicly facing tool that our friends, our Health Leads is Friends with All Home, created. It's a publicly facing database for a selection of Bay Area wide housing resources. And to the point that you made, Michael, none of the things that we looked at in our landscape discovery, and I am not saying we looked at all the things, but none of them checked all of the boxes that you all identified. Some checked more than others, right? And so I think part of this too is continue to share with us existing tools that exist. I think what's different about what we're creating and what will help what you all have decided to create and to continue to go after that intersection of scrappy but potentially game changing is thinking about those service providers and keeping those service providers in mind as it relates to navigating both Cal-AIM and non-Cal-AIM services to support the community members who are in front of them every day. None of these other tools are built with that in mind, from what I can tell. Again, we need to have more conversations. I am sure we haven't looked at everything, so we can add the All Home database to the list. And One Degree is a great and collaborative partner from my past experience with them. But again, that's a publicly facing tool like Contra Costa 211 versus something that's going to have, well, what capacity do service providers have for more referrals? So again, just trying to triangulate. I don't know, Jamie, if you want to offer more voiceover on your perspective on what All Home launched or any other systems that you're proximal to.
No, I'm just thinking more of kind of what's out there and what pieces can we take from each of them to suit our needs.
Yeah. I appreciate that. And to riff off of what Amy initially offered in this conversation too around interoperability, one of the things that I'm thinking about, because I am so tired of having these conversations about lists, is not just interoperability as it relates to the service providers who are navigating each of these systems, but also interoperability for all these different directories that exist. Like, how much work is one degree doing that Contra Costa 211 is already doing, that CC Health is doing, right? And is there a resource directory interoperability as well that, again, might not be need to have for this conversation, but might be a nice to have for our ecosystem when we think about spending resources well. I'm not here to say there needs to be one database to rule them all. I read Lord of the Rings, one ring to rule them all is a great way to create a lot of trouble, is the summary of those books, if you ask me. But I do think that's part of that is something that I think we can also keep our eye on, particularly as we have these conversations with these admins. And I saw a few people in the chat that seem to resonate with folks. So I'm glad to know that I'm not bananas in thinking about that. Already, any other this is such a helpful conversation. Again, y'all, we are admittedly doing more presenting back out than we usually do, but it's because we've had so many conversations and we want to close the loop. So let me just pause and see if there's any other reactions or questions or other ideas before we get into the actual what will the test look like. Cool. Okay. Also, I love how much we're all using the word scrappy. That would make my father happy. We can go to the next slide.
Can I say that's literally like our thing in H3 is nice and scrappy. Like, we're all nice, but we're scrappy. So it's, yeah, totally relate to the word.
I appreciate it as a person who tends to be scrappy myself. I also just think responsibly, y'all, if we don't enjoy being scrappy and testing, we're going to spend a lot of energy on building something that might not work, right? And so let's enjoy the process, and call out, yeah, we're going to be scrappy and we're going to have fun in the process. And hopefully we'll get to something that we'll be proud of on the other side. So with that, what's the test going to look like? Step one, cohort one, right? Has to be, we need this initial information. Again, we've done a landscape discovery. We looked at Contra Costa 211. We looked at Contra Costa Health. The fact of the matter is neither of those tools that currently exist as public resource databases for Contra Costa County has the information you all are interested in. So this initial test is the test of collecting the baseline information. Does that mean you guys are going to provide information in some parts that already exist in other places? Yeah, unfortunately. But part of what we have to do is test the process of collecting information and starting from the beginning. So what we're going to do is we're going to test, again, we're testing process, not product. This is going to be a survey with branched logic, so people don't get burdened with questions that aren't relevant. We are going to test the collection of information. Every organization that participates in the test is going to create what will become an organization profile with some basic information. This is the stuff that's probably already publicly available, but we got to start from the beginning and we got to figure out how does this baseline information work, right? So we'll start with that. Then based upon answers to your questions, you will go into one or two pathways that we've developed. There is a specific pathway we've developed that asks questions about CalAIM services because there's specific language, vernacular, eligibility, populations of focus, etc., around CalAIM services. It'll ask you to catalog what types of services do you provide with regards to ECM and the 14 community supports, who you're contracted with in the present state. We know that that is temporally bound information. We'll talk about how we're going to think about updating that in a second, and also what your maximum capacity is for those services. For the other non-CalAIM services, so for those other supports, you're going to be able to use the service tree language that Contra Costa 211's created. It looked great. We're just going to try it on and log information. Both For every type of service you provide. So if you provide 5 services, you will then have to complete 5 program specific information. Okay, I am organization A and I provide service 1. Well, for service 1, here's my point of contact. Here's who you have to, here's how you make a referral. Here's the eligibility for service 1. Here's our geographic service area for service 1. For service 2, that information around point of contact, referral, eligibility, and geographic area might be the same. And if that's the case, you'll be able to just proceed. It also might not be the same. That is something we heard in the design sessions, is like service to service within my organization, the instructions and nuance around how to access services actually does change. And I, being inside of my own institution, may or may not know the nuances there, but I do know that there are nuances. So the survey will allow us to actually ask that level of nuanced information, which also felt like, again, from a surface level landscape discovery that we were able to do, that also felt like an area of difference from this process versus what's publicly available presently. As you'll see here, there are future data elements that we will be thinking about adding once we collect initial information. But for right now, these are kind of those green and yellow dots that we showed you in what information is wanted based upon our conversations. Let me just pause, make sure I didn't forget anything, internal team, and then participants, if you guys have any questions. I will offer, I went through the survey yesterday with final eyes. It probably takes about 3 to 5 minutes for every service or program area that you all have. So the more services you have, the longer it'll probably take you. That's probably not surprising, but let's make the implicit explicit and also acknowledge doing work takes time. So it will take some time. And part of what we want to do too is test. We're phasing right now because we want to test how viable is it for you all to provide this information. Again, testing out what we heard in the design sessions, which is, I know my organization best. Danny, did you want to jump in?
Yeah, I would just add that in addition to the information that we're collecting as a part of this test, we also have 3 very short questions to collect data on the test itself to understand, is this something that is going to work for you all? Are there changes that we need to make? So you will see kind of 3 questions at the end that are specific to this test and measurement of this test for us to better understand how to iterate over time.
Awesome. All righty. So let's go to the next slide. We've been hearing mention of this, but let's make the implicit explicit as it relates to this bounds of the test. Again, we are testing the viability of initial inventorying process, but we're going to do it in 2 phases. Phase 1 is what we're launching today, which is like, we got to create the baseline. We got to create initial organization profiles with initial program service information, right? And elements of program service information and elements of the services provided. It might change over time. You might not be contracted today, but maybe in February you will be, right? For certain services. A point of contact might change. So while phase 1 of the test is collecting the initial information, phase 2, which will be next year in Q1, is going to focus on, again, empowering you all as service providers with the ability to update your own information off of the existing set of data, either because that information's out of date, or because a data field represents something that's a more real-time measure. Again, am I contracted or am I not? Thinking about the future of capacity, right? In a world where we can be more specific than I am available or unavailable. So phase 1 tests that initial registration process. Phase 2 tests the process of actually updating the information. Again, there are 2 cohorts of testing here. So cohort 2 will look at the actual visual that this data is summarized in and ask, does that visual help you navigate and understand the services that already exist? So I just want to acknowledge that there's a lot of pieces and moving elements here, and we're trying to add some method to what can be madness. And you can always help us understand if we're hitting that intention or not. Let me just pause to see if folks have questions, comments, or concerns about kind of the phases of the first testing cohort. Is everybody like super excited to log all your information? Probably not, but you should be super excited for the thing on the other side, so please do it. All right, we can go to the next slide, which we need to update. We'll update these slides before we send this out, but this meeting is usually 90 minutes. We are going to end at the hour because we want to give you time to submit your organization and program information because we are already on your calendar for these 90 minutes. So acknowledging that in this moment, we're going to end a little bit early, but there are a lot of next steps. So let me round us out on next steps. For us as facilitators, there is a lot of work here. There's a lot of work here for all of us. For us as facilitators, here's a few things we're going to do. We're going to send the initial test invite to all participants. That certainly is here for all of you that are here live. Anybody who's watching this recording, thank you so much. Actually take the test. And anybody who is registered for the PATH CPI. As we have seen in past processes, it's always helpful for people to hear from their friends and the people that they trust in their service community to encourage folks. So I will say we will own the communication, but we really encourage you all to tap the shoulders of your partners whose information you would want seen here and to help us get more people invited to this actual test. The other thing that we will do as facilitating team is we were going to schedule some discovery meetings with potential resource directory hosts that CPI has identified. We talked about 2-on-1 in the housing design conversation. Folks identified the ArcGIS map administrators for Contra Costa County. We've obviously identified the Find Help site and start to ask more of those double quick questions, like the question of interoperability, like the question of how do you actually get your resource information and what does that look like? And comparing the specific fields, again, particularly because we are only able in this moment to look at what's publicly available and there might be more information on the back end. But we feel pretty confident, given all the conversations we've had with you all, that this is a venture worth doing. It is new. And yes, there is stuff that's out there that might look similar, but it doesn't entirely hit the marks we're trying to hit. And that's what we're here to try to create. The other thing that we're going to do is just on the admin side, create a 2024 meeting schedule, which will include the design session for the ECM providers. Originally, that design session was supposed to be at the end of this month. We're just acknowledging it's the holiday season is upon us. I can't believe it's already November 15th. And then beyond that, we're asking a lot from you guys. So we're actually just going to move that design session to Q1 of next year. And that design session is going to really focus on what might the solution look like for folks to actually navigate the visual. We got some initial ideas from some design sessions. We want to have more of those conversations. Let me just pause and see, particularly Intrepid Ascent team, did I miss anything or any other voiceover on what we're going to do that might be missing?
I don't think so. I guess just related to this last bullet, in addition to doing this test, we're, as Lauren mentioned, we're in the process of defining what 2024 will look like. And we want to get clear about at least kind of the cadence of meetings, the topics that we want to focus on, get a little bit clearer on what the what is going into next year. So if you all have feedback or thoughts about that, feel free to reach out to us. Lene isn't here, but she shared, last time that we getting a little bit more clear around the audience for the monthly meetings, and then the coffee chats, if we continue them, would be really helpful. So she knows, is there a place to send any of her providers directly rather than herself joining? So that's something that we've earmarked, but that's the feedback that we're really looking for. Or if there's a specific kind of topic area you really want to lean into, let us know. So all of that just as a ask. If there's ideas that you have about how we can make this better, definitely let us know. And then we will make sure to send the registration link out for the December 20th meeting. And just acknowledging that that's the week before the week of Christmas. So if folks are on vacation, just make sure that you register for that and let us know if you registered and you can't attend, just so we get a better sense of how many people will be there and won't be there given the holiday season.
Can I, looking at this with fresh eyes, if I can ask a question of you all as participants, would it be helpful if we armed you with some template outreach language for you to do outreach to either your, again, service provider partners, or I know we've got some MCP representatives on the phone, the people that you all are contracted with? Would you all find that helpful to signal boost this initial cohort test with your colleagues?
This is Elena. I think that's always helpful. If you could send that information, that'd be great.
Yeah, I would agree.
Yeah,
Awesome.
so I would agree as well.
Awesome. We can totally do that, and we can add that to the list of things that we'll do to help with the communication. Okay, on your side, then we will also add a to-do to this, which is to signal boost using that tool that we'll now develop as of like 30 seconds ago, but it's not that hard to do. We're asking past CPI participants, for those that provide services, to submit your organization and program information by the end of the month. That's a really, really important deadline, because in that meeting in December, we want to show you what the output of that looks like, and we need time to develop it. So please, 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 2 weeks to do this should be enough, I hope. I do know that there's the Thanksgiving holiday there. We will pay attention to submission, but please try to hit that deadline for us so that we can have an initial mock-up on the back end to look at in December. And to Danny's point, there will be a last meeting on December 20th. Already starting to indicate what that meeting will start to include. Again, this test will span beyond the months of November and December, so don't worry about only 2 months during the holidays, but we are getting started right now. So attending that meeting, and again, we'll add that to do of for all of those. No worries, thanks, Jamie. We'll add that to do as it relates to signal boosting using the communication tools that we can develop for you all. Any other last minute items before we go? No.
I have nothing.
Cool. All right, y'all. This is the place where it's not sexy, but it's super important, right? Small tests of change, joyfully scrappy, sometimes scrappy crappy, gets us to progress. So, Intrepid team, anything else on our side before we close out?
No, just be on the lookout for an email with some next steps. That what we put here will be there, as well as some language, like Lauren said, around promoting this, and the registration link for the 20th.
Awesome.
Great.
Thanks, folks, for your time. We really appreciate it. We will see you in December. I hope everyone has a good Thanksgiving.
Bye.
Bye, folks.